As of this writing, over one-third of the world's population is currently in quarantine or facing some type of lockdown or restriction. So it wouldn't be surprising to see some lasting impacts from this COVID-19 pandemic. You can expect new houses to contain quarantine amenities, just like the Cold War-inspired bomb shelters, TV shows to add coronavirus episodes, and more people to ditch underwear after having discovered during their time working from home that fewer layers are more comfortable. In the past, there have been at least 10 such cultural, scientific, and politically defining moments. Number 10. Quarantine. The English word quarantine was initially used to describe a period in which a potential disease-carrying ship was kept in isolation. The word was first used in the 17th century, and it is derived from the Italian expression 40 giorni, which means 40 days. The bubonic plague outbreak that ripped through the European continent resulted in one of the most significant die-offs in human history. In the mid-1300s, the plague spread through iconic European cities, including Venice. In 1377. Authorities in the Republic of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, Croatia, legislated Trentino, which required incoming ships from plague-affected regions to stay isolated for 30 days before anyone could debark. Number 9. Quarantine flags. Any 2-cent government worth its salt knows that epidemics affect its economy across numerous fronts, including the agricultural, health, transportation, and foreign trade sectors. As a result, humans have responded for centuries to the threat of morbidity and mortality from epidemics through coordinated disease control strategies. The quarantine flag is one such method. Number 8. Bible enumerates guidelines. An early reference is made to quarantine in the Bible. The book of Leviticus, which was probably written in the 6th century BC, described a procedure for preventing an epidemic under the Mosaic dispensation. It commanded that infectious people be quarantined for a while until the priests declared them healthy. Laws like these are usually referred to as case laws. They are representative of the various types of real-life cases that people might have encountered back then. Number 7. The Apollo. NASA went to extraordinary lengths to isolate the 3 astronauts who returned from the unforgettable One Small Step for Man, One Giant Leap for Mankind Apollo 11 mission. Before this mission, expeditions involving close-orbit lunar navigation had determined that the moon was not made of cheese or any such nonsense. Even so, no one at the time was sure whether the moon was sterile. So, there was a need to prevent potential moon germs from ravaging the Earth's populace. Number 6. Variations of a disease. In the past, people with irregular variations of a disease have been asked to isolate themselves when there was no outbreak. In 2007, for example, Andrew Speaker, a lawyer from Atlanta, was diagnosed with a drug-resistant strain of tuberculosis. Subsequently, he was instructed by the CDC to isolate himself. At first, he fled. However, he was later apprehended and quarantined at the National Jewish Medical and Research Center in Denver. There, he was cured. Number 5. Social distancing. With the bubonic plague ravaging London in 1665, social distancing instructions caused campuses all around England to become empty. It seemed unfair at that time for most people, but not for a certain student at Trinity College, Cambridge, named Isaac Newton. Free of the university curriculum and his professors, Newton dove into discovery. In the 18 months he spent in isolation, Newton laid the foundations for calculus, investigated optics, and determined that white light consisted of all components of the visible spectrum. The revolutionary law of universal gravity was also born at his home in Woolsthorpe Manor. Number 4. King Lear and Rive. Frankenstein. Sir Isaac Newton was just one of the many geniuses of antiquity who achieved incredible things while confined to his house. In addition to scientific breakthroughs during quarantines, there have been artistic ones in the form of literature. The popular King Lear was written by William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon, during the 1606 quarantine. He also wrote Macbeth during this period. In 1816, during a cholera epidemic that affected most of Europe, 19-year-old Mary Shelley came up with the genius idea to write the first science fiction novel, Frankenstein, while in confinement. Number 3. Governments. 1793 was perhaps the most awful year in the history of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The summer was scorching hot and humid, and the streets were littered with the bodies of those who had succumbed to the American plague, yellow fever. It struck Philadelphia hard. Doctors didn't know the origin of the disease or understand that it was transmitted by mosquitoes. Number 2. Effectiveness of quarantines. While quarantines have proven effective in stopping the spread of diseases in populated areas, not everyone is on board with it. The ethics and the effectiveness of this response remain debated subjects. When the SARS coronavirus broke out in Canada in 2003, the whole of Toronto was placed under quasi-quarantine. The following year, one study suggested that public health officials should have focused solely on contact tracing instead of enforced quarantine. Number 1. Island of Death. There are countless uninhabited islands on our beautiful blue planet. Some of them are unexplored, some are cordoned off to function as wildlife sanctuaries, and some have a much grimmer reason for keeping people out. Enter the spooky Gruinard Island. After requisitioning this little island from its residents during World War II, British forces began testing the feasibility of using a deadly biological weapon called anthrax on Gruinard. As they were scared of the threat of an imminent Nazi chemical attack, the Allied forces considered deploying first. They tested a strain of anthrax called Volum 14578, which was very severe. All 80 sheep placed in the detonation zone for the experiment died within days of exposure. The war ended in 1945, and the weapon was never used. The initial owner then requested the return of his island. However, it had become uninhabitable, and mass decontamination would have been very costly.